My name is Aaron Whitmore, and for the past 12 years, I've been the winter caretaker of the Crescent Ridge Lodge in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado. It's a remote property, accessible only by a narrow, winding forest road that gets snowed in from November through March. During the summer months, the lodge operates as a high-end retreat for hikers, hunters, and tourists looking to escape into the wilderness. But in winter, it's closed to the public. My job is to keep the pipes from freezing, the roof from caving in under the snow, and the property secure until the spring thaw. It's solitary work, the kind of job that attracts people who don't mind being alone for months at a time. I'm one of those people. I like the silence, I like the routine, and I especially like the fact that for 4 months out of the year, I don't have to deal with anyone. Or at least, I didn't used to have to. The lodge itself is a sprawling 2-story structure built in the 1960s, all timber and stone, with a massive fireplace in the main hall and 15 guest rooms spread across the upper floor. The architecture is classic mountain lodge, exposed beams, vaulted ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the valley below. It's surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, with the 4th side opening up to a sweeping view of the mountains. In the summer, it's beautiful. In the winter, it's isolated. The nearest town, Silverton, is 40 miles away, and once the snows come, that road is impassable without a snowmobile or snowcat. The lodge's history is long and mostly unremarkable. It was built by a mining family in the 60s as a private retreat, then converted to a commercial lodge in the 80s. It's changed hands a few times, but the basic operation has remained the same. Summer season brings tourists, winter brings emptiness, and someone like me keeps watch through the cold months. I'd spent 11 winters at Crescent Ridge without incident. The work was predictable. Clear snow from the roof and walkways, keep the generator running, check the traps I'd set for rodents, and make sure the structure stayed sound. I had a satellite phone for emergencies, a well-stocked pantry, and enough firewood to last until April. I didn't need anything else. My routine was simple and unvarying. I'd wake at 7, make coffee, and do a full walk around of the property to check for damage from the previous night's snowfall. I'd clear the main paths, check the generator fuel levels, and inspect the roof for any signs of stress. Afternoons were for maintenance, fixing whatever needed fixing, organizing supplies, reading. Evenings I spent by the fire, usually with a book or the battery-powered radio if I could get a signal. I was in bed by 10. It was lonely, yes, but I preferred it that way. I'd spent my 20s working construction in Denver, surrounded by noise and people and constant demands on my attention. After my divorce, I'd wanted something different, something quiet. When I saw the posting for a winter caretaker position, it seemed perfect. 12 years later, it still was. Christmas 2019 started like every other Christmas I'd spent at the lodge. I woke early, made coffee, and spent the morning clearing snow from the main entrance. The sky was overcast, and the temperature hovered around 15 degrees. By noon, it had started snowing again. Big, fat flakes that fell silently and piled up fast. I spent the afternoon inside, sitting by the fire with a book and a glass of whiskey. The lodge was warm and quiet, the only sounds the crackle of burning wood and the occasional groan of the old structure settling under the weight of snow. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wasn't expecting anything. It was just another day. I'd made myself a decent Christmas dinner. Nothing fancy, just a roasted chicken breast, some canned vegetables, and mashed potatoes from a box. I ate in the main hall at one of the long dining tables, staring out at the snow falling past the windows. The forest was already buried under 4 feet of powder, and the forecast called for another 6 inches overnight. That changed around 6 p.m. I was in the kitchen, heating up a can of soup for a late snack, when I heard it. The distant sound of an engine. I froze, the ladle halfway to my mouth. It couldn't be. Nobody came up here in the winter. The road was completely snowed over. You'd need a snowcat or a serious four-wheel drive rig with chains to even attempt it. And even then, it would be suicide in weather like this. The Forest Service didn't even maintain the road from December through March. It was officially closed, marked with barriers at the base of the mountain. But the sound was unmistakable. A low, rumbling engine, growing louder. Not the high-pitched whine of a snowmobile, but the deep growl of a large vehicle. I set the ladle down and walked to the front window. The snow was falling so thick now that I could barely see 10 feet past the porch, but through the swirling white, I saw lights. Headlights. 2 of them, cutting through the darkness, growing brighter as they approached. A vehicle pulled into the clearing in front of the lodge and stopped. It was a large, black SUV, caked in snow and mud, its engine idling. I couldn't see inside. The windows were heavily tinted, darker than seemed legal. But I could see the exhaust puffing out in thick clouds. The vehicle just sat there, engine running, headlights pointed directly at the lodge. For a long moment, nothing happened. The SUV just sat there, engine running, headlights blazing. Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and thin, dressed in a heavy black overcoat and leather gloves. His face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his features were sharp. High cheekbones, a narrow jaw, deep-set eyes that seemed to catch the light in strange ways. He looked at the lodge, then at me through the window and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you'd see on someone who knew a secret you didn't. The kind of smile that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, but I pushed it aside. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit me immediately, and the snow swirled around me, clinging to my hair and beard. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice carrying across the clearing. The man approached slowly, his boots crunching in the snow. He didn't seem bothered by the cold, even though he wasn't wearing a hat or scarf. His breath didn't steam in the frigid air, which I noticed, but didn't process immediately. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth and faintly accented. European, maybe, though I couldn't place it. Eastern European, possibly. I apologize for arriving unannounced. My companions and I found ourselves in need of shelter. "This lodge is closed for the winter," I said. "There's a motel in Silverton, about 40 miles south. If you head back down—" "We've just come from Silverton," he interrupted. "The roads are impassable. We won't make it back tonight." He gestured toward the SUV. "There are 4 of us. We're willing to pay whatever you think is fair." I hesitated. The lodge wasn't open for business, and I wasn't supposed to let anyone in without authorization from the owners. But the weather was getting worse by the minute, and if they tried to drive back down the mountain in this, they'd end up frozen in a ditch. I'd heard stories of people getting stranded on that road, their vehicles buried under avalanches or frozen solid overnight. People died out here. "All right," I said finally. "But just for tonight. You'll have to leave first thing in the morning when the weather clears." "Of course," the man said, his smile widening. "You're very kind. We won't be any trouble." He turned and waved toward the SUV. The other doors opened, and 3 more figures stepped out. The first was a woman, tall and slender, with long dark hair that fell past her shoulders in a straight curtain. She wore a tailored black coat and heels, completely impractical for the snow, but she moved through it as if it weren't there. Her face was as pale as the man's, with the same sharp features. She didn't look cold. She didn't look anything. The second was another man, shorter and stockier, with a shaved head and a thick beard. He was dressed more appropriately for the weather, in a parka and boots. But there was something off about him. His movements were too stiff, too mechanical, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He walked with his arms held slightly away from his body, and his head moved in jerky increments, as if his neck didn't bend properly. The third was a child, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with blonde hair and a pale blue dress. No coat, no shoes, no socks. She stood in the snow, barefoot, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask where her coat was, why she wasn't dressed for the weather, what kind of parents would let their child stand barefoot in a blizzard. But the man spoke first. "Shall we go inside? It's quite cold out here." I nodded slowly, unable to tear my gaze away from the little girl. She hadn't moved, hadn't shivered, hadn't blinked. Her feet were bare against the snow, but there was no redness, no sign of cold or discomfort. She just stood there, staring. "Your daughter," I said, my voice tight. She's fine," the woman said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "She doesn't feel the cold." That should have been my first warning. That should have been the moment I turned them away, locked the door, and radioed for help. But I didn't. Instead, I told myself she must be in shock, or maybe she had some kind of medical condition. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. The 4 of them followed me into the lodge. I led them to the main hall where the fire was still burning. The tall man and the woman sat down on the couch near the fireplace, moving in perfect synchronization. The stocky man stood by the window, staring out at the snow with his back to us. The little girl sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her pale blue dress spread out around her like a pool of water. "I'll get some rooms ready for you," I said, trying to sound casual, trying to ignore the way my instincts were screaming at me. "There's no running water. Pipes are winterized, but I can bring up some bottled water and extra blankets. Are you hungry? I've got soup, and..." "We're not hungry," the tall man said. He was still smiling. "But thank you." The woman said nothing. The stocky man didn't turn around. The little girl stared into the fire, unblinking. I nodded and retreated upstairs, my mind racing. Something about these people was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to get them out of here. But what was I supposed to do? Throw them out into a blizzard? I prepared 3 rooms, one for the man and woman, one for the stocky man, and one for the little girl. I brought up blankets, bottled water, and a few toiletries from the supply closet. The whole time, I kept thinking about that little girl's bare feet on the snow, the way her skin hadn't been red or blue, but pale and perfect, as if the cold hadn't touched her at all. When I came back downstairs, they were exactly where I'd left them. The tall man and woman on the couch, the stocky man by the window, the little girl on the floor. None of them had moved. None of them had spoken. They just sat there, staring into the fire. "Your rooms are ready," I said. "Top of the stairs, first 3 doors on the left." "Thank you," the tall man said. He didn't move. I waited for a moment, then turned and headed back to the kitchen. I wasn't hungry anymore, but I needed to do something, needed to keep my hands busy. I cleaned the dishes, wiped down the counters, checked the generator, anything to avoid going back into that room. But eventually, I had no choice. I returned to the main hall to stoke the fire before bed, adding another log to keep it burning through the night. They were still there, still sitting in the exact same positions. The little girl was still staring into the flames, her eyes wide and glassy, reflecting the firelight in an unsettling way. She hadn't moved a muscle. "Are you folks planning to head up to bed soon?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Soon," the tall man said. That was all. Just soon. No explanation. No movement. I nodded and added another log to the fire, then retreated to my own quarters. A small room off the kitchen on the ground floor. I locked the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, my heart pounding. I told myself I was being ridiculous. They were just travelers, caught in a storm. There was nothing sinister about them. But I couldn't shake the image of that little girl, standing barefoot in the snow, staring at me with those wide, unblinking eyes. I couldn't shake the way none of them seemed to breathe, the way they moved with that strange, synchronized precision. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. At some point, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the lodge. They passed my door, paused for a long moment just outside, then continued down the hall. I didn't get up to check. I didn't want to know. The footsteps went on for hours, up the stairs, down the stairs, through the halls, around and around in endless circuits. Always the same rhythm, always the same pattern, never stopping. When morning finally came, I unlocked my door and stepped out into the hall. The lodge was silent. The fire had burned down to embers, and pale gray light filtered through the windows. The snow had stopped falling, and the world outside was buried under a fresh blanket of white. I made my way to the main hall, half expecting to find the four of them still sitting there, unmoving. But the room was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, and the couch where the man and woman had been sitting was undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. The cushions weren't compressed. There was no warmth lingering from body heat. I climbed the stairs to check the guest rooms. All 3 doors were open. The beds were still made, the blankets untouched. The bottled water I'd left on the nightstands was still sealed. It was as if they'd never gone upstairs at all. I walked back downstairs and looked out the front window. The SUV was gone. The snow had covered any tracks it might have left. In fact, there were no tracks at all, no tire marks, no footprints leading to or from the lodge. Just smooth, undisturbed snow. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I saw it. A single set of small footprints leading from the porch to the edge of the clearing, where they disappeared into the trees. Barefoot footprints, child-sized. I stood there for a long time, staring at those prints, my breath fogging the glass. The prints were perfect, too perfect. Each toe was clearly defined, pressed into the snow with more weight than a child should have. And they didn't sink the way normal footprints would. They were shallow, as if whatever made them barely weighed anything at all. I grabbed my coat and boots and went outside to investigate. The cold was brutal, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache. I followed the footprints to the edge of the clearing, where they led into the forest. The trees were thick here, their branches heavy with snow, and the ground beneath was a maze of roots and fallen logs. The footprints continued into the forest, perfectly spaced, never deviating. I followed them for maybe 50 yards before they simply stopped. Not at a tree, not at a rock, just stopped in the middle of a small clearing, as if whatever made them had simply vanished into thin air. I stood there, staring at the place where the footprints ended, feeling the cold seep through my coat. The forest was absolutely silent. No birds, no wind, no sound at all except my own breathing. I turned and walked back to the lodge, my mind racing. What had I let into the building last night? What had I spoken to? What had sat in my main hall, staring into my fire? I spent the rest of the day checking every room, every closet, every corner of the lodge. I was looking for something, anything, that would prove they'd been there. A strand of hair, a fingerprint, a scrap of fabric. But there was nothing. The lodge was exactly as it had been before they arrived, except for one thing. In the main hall, On the stone hearth in front of the fireplace, there was a mark. It looked like ash at first, but when I bent down to examine it, I realized it was something else. It was a symbol drawn in what looked like soot or charcoal, a circle with lines radiating outward and strange characters around the perimeter that I didn't recognize. I stared at it for a long time, then grabbed a rag and scrubbed it away. The soot came off easily, leaving no trace behind. But I'd seen it. I knew it had been there. That night, I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe they were survivalists or thrill seekers or performance artists doing some kind of social experiment. Maybe the little girl had been wearing some kind of cold-resistant material on her feet that I hadn't noticed. Maybe the SUV had left through some back road I didn't know about, but I didn't believe any of that. Deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever I'd let into the lodge that night hadn't been human. The next few days passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I went outside, I'd see movement in the corner of my eye, a flash of pale blue among the trees, a shadow that didn't belong. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. At night, I'd hear footsteps again, the same slow, deliberate pattern, circling the lodge. I'd look out the window, but I never saw anyone, just footprints in the snow, appearing in real time, as if invisible feet were walking past. I started sleeping with the lights on. I started checking the doors and windows multiple times before bed, making sure they were locked. I kept the fireplace poker next to my bed within easy reach. A week after Christmas, I was outside clearing snow from the roof when I found something. Caught on one of the shingles near the chimney was a piece of fabric. Pale blue fabric, torn and frayed, like it had been ripped from a dress. I held it in my gloved hand, staring at it. It was definitely from the little girl's dress, which meant she'd been on the roof. But when and why? I looked around, scanning the forest, the clearing, the road. Nothing. Just snow and trees and silence. That night, I heard scratching on the windows. Soft at first, like branches brushing against glass, but then louder, more insistent. I got up and looked, pressing my face to the cold glass, but saw nothing outside except darkness and falling snow. The scratching moved to another window, then another. It was circling the lodge, moving from window to window, always just out of sight. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the front door, throwing it open. The cold air rushed in, and I shone the light out into the darkness. The beam cut through the falling snow, illuminating the clearing. And then I saw them, all four of them, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light. The tall man, the woman, the stocky man, and the little girl. They were perfectly still, staring at the lodge, staring at me. "Get the hell off my property!" I shouted, my voice cracking. They didn't move, didn't respond. They just stood there, watching. I stepped back inside and slammed the door, locking it. My hands were shaking. I went to every window and closed every curtain, blocking out the darkness. Then I sat by the fire, the poker in my hands, and waited for morning. The scratching continued all night, sometimes on the windows, sometimes on the walls, sometimes on the roof, directly above my head. But I didn't look. I didn't go outside. I just sat by the fire and waited. When dawn finally came, I opened the front door and looked out. The clearing was empty. No figures, no footprints, just fresh snow, smooth and undisturbed. But I knew they'd been there. I'd seen them. I tried to call the lodge owners on the satellite phone, but I couldn't get a signal. The weather had been interfering with communications for weeks, and now it seemed worse than ever. I thought about leaving, hiking down the mountain to Silverton, but the road was still impassable. I was trapped. The visits continued. Every few nights, they'd return. Sometimes I'd see them from a window, standing in the forest. Sometimes I'd hear them on the roof. Sometimes I'd find their footprints in the morning, circling the lodge in complex patterns. I stopped sleeping. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that little girl's face, pale and expressionless, staring at me with those wide, unblinking eyes. I started researching online, using the lodge's spotty satellite internet connection. I searched for stories about strange visitors, about entities that appeared human but weren't, about children who didn't feel the cold. I found fragments, old folklore, urban legends, obscure academic papers about mimics and changelings and things that walked in the skin of the dead. One story from a forum about paranormal experiences stuck with me. A man in Alaska had described something similar. Visitors who arrived during a storm, who didn't eat or sleep or breathe, who left no trace except strange symbols. He said they came every year, always on the same night, always asking to be let in. He said that once you let them in, they never really left. They'd keep coming back, year after year, until you either left or died. I thought about running, about abandoning my post and hiking out, consequences be damned. But something kept me there. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. I'd lasted 12 winters. I wasn't going to be driven out by some, whatever they were. February passed, then March. The snows began to lighten and the days grew longer. The road became passable again, and the first supply truck arrived in early April. The driver commented that I looked terrible, that I'd lost weight, that I should probably see a doctor. I didn't tell him why. When the owners arrived in May to reopen the lodge for summer season, I gave my notice. I told them I was getting too old for the isolation, that I wanted to be closer to family. They understood. They thanked me for my years of service and wished me well. I left Crescent Ridge in June and moved to Denver. I got a job as a building superintendent, working in a high-rise with hundreds of residents. I wanted noise, crowds, people. I never wanted to be alone again. But every Christmas, when the snow starts falling and the nights grow long, I think about that lodge in the mountains. I think about those 4 figures standing at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting. And I wonder who the new caretaker is. I wonder if they've met the visitors yet. I wonder if they let them in. Because I know they'll come back. They come back every year, like clockwork. On Christmas night, when the world is buried in snow and silence, they arrive. They knock on the door, or they simply appear in the clearing, waiting to be invited inside. And once you let them in, they never really leave. I still have nightmares about that little girl, about her bare feet in the snow, about her wide, unblinking eyes, about the way she smiled at me just once before she disappeared into the trees. It wasn't a child's smile. It was something ancient and hungry, something that had learned to wear the shape of a child, but couldn't quite get the expression right. I don't know what they were. I don't know what they wanted. But I know they're still there, in those mountains, waiting for the next person to open the door. And every Christmas, when I'm safe in my apartment in Denver, surrounded by lights and noise and people, I still hear it. The soft scratching on the window. The slow, deliberate footsteps circling the building. And I know, deep down, that one day I'll look out the window and see them standing there, still waiting, still watching, still hungry, still